Welcome to History Before Sleep Stories. Here we travel through the shadows of time, softly, slowly, carefully, so you can fall asleep with a mind full of wonder. Settle in, close your eyes, and let the past begin to unfold. In the heart of Rome, where ancient stones remember emperors and saints, where the Tiber flows as it has flowed for millennia, there stands a place that exists outside ordinary time, a repository of whispers and ink, of sealed letters and fading, parchment where 2,000 years of human hope and human failing rest in gentle darkness, waiting. The secret archives of the Vatican, though the word secret misleads us, for in Latin secretum means simply private, personal, belonging to someone. And these archives belong to the Church, to memory itself, to all the voices that once cried out in joy or anguish and found their way onto paper, preserved against the silence that claims all things. The very name conjures mystery, does it not? Secret archives. And with those words come legends that have grown like vines over centuries, stories whispered in shadowed corners and printed in sensational volumes, tales of forbidden knowledge and hidden power. And before we walk together through these corridors of memory, before we touch with reverent hands the documents that shaped our world, let us pause and consider the myths, the dreams that humans have projected onto this place, for even in their falsehood, they tell us something true about what we long for and what we fear. The first myth speaks of gospels hidden away, texts written in the years when Christ walked the earth or shortly after, accounts that contradict the approved narratives, that tell a different story of divinity and humanity, perhaps revealing that Jesus was merely a teacher, a revolutionary, a man like other men, or conversely, that he possessed powers and knowledge the official church chose to suppress. And in this myth, the Vatican becomes a censor of truth, hiding documents that would shatter faith or transform it utterly, keeping locked away the real story of Christianity's origins while presenting to the faithful a carefully curated version designed to maintain institutional power. Yet when we examine the archives with care, when scholars spend their days reading through document after document, what emerges is not hidden gospels, but something more prosaic and more precious, the careful records of an institution that has endured nearly 2 millennia. And while the Church has certainly made choices about which texts to consider canonical and which to reject as apocryphal, these decisions were made openly in councils and recorded in documents that scholars can access. The archives contain no secret cache of alternative gospels, no hidden account of Jesus that contradicts the 4 canonical narratives. What they contain instead is correspondence and administration, the daily work of governing a global church. And, while some might find this disappointing, it is in fact remarkable, for these ordinary documents allow us to reconstruct centuries of history with extraordinary detail. The second myth tells of material treasures, not merely gold and jewels, though those feature in the stories, but knowledge plundered from dying civilizations, the lost books of the Library of Alexandria, spirited away before flames consumed that monument to ancient learning, scrolls from Egypt revealing the secrets of pyramid construction, tablets from Mesopotamia containing wisdom older than Abraham, all hidden in Vatican vaults, transformed from humanity's common heritage into the private possession of the Church. And those who believe this myth imagine vast underground chambers filled with artifacts and manuscripts, guarded jealously, studied in secret, their contents never shared with the wider world. The reality, as always, proves more complex and less dramatic. The Library of Alexandria declined over centuries, not in a single catastrophic fire, its holdings dispersed gradually through neglect, war, religious conflict, and changing political circumstances. Some texts were copied and preserved, yes, and some of those copies eventually made their way to Rome through various paths of transmission. But there was no secret rescue mission, no hidden preservation of the entire library's contents. And what manuscripts the Vatican does possess from antiquity are studied by scholars, published, discussed, not concealed. The Church's attitude toward classical learning has generally been one of preservation rather than suppression. For it was Christian monks in medieval scriptoriums who copied Virgil and Ovid, Plato and Aristotle, preserving pagan wisdom even as they devoted themselves to Christian faith. The third myth speaks of evidence of the supernatural, carefully documented encounters with demons and angels, investigations into miracles that definitively prove or disprove their occurrence, records of exorcisms so terrifying they must be kept from public view lest they disturb the faith of believers or inspire dangerous curiosity, perhaps even documents relating to extraterrestrial visitations. For some versions of this myth, imagine the Church as repository of all unexplained phenomena, maintaining files on everything from UFO sightings to time travelers, carefully cataloging the impossible and filing it away in darkness. And here we find a kernel of truth wrapped in exaggeration. The archives do contain records of exorcisms, for exorcism has been part of Catholic practice since the faith's earliest days, and they contain investigations into reported miracles, for the Church approaches claims of the miraculous with careful skepticism, gathering evidence, consulting experts, examining witnesses, before pronouncing any event as genuinely supernatural, and these records exist in the archives, testimony to centuries of human beings reporting extraordinary experiences. But what they document is belief and investigation, not proof of the supernatural itself. They tell us what people claimed to witness, what investigators concluded, how the Church responded, but they cannot resolve the fundamental questions of whether miracles actually occur, for such questions lie beyond what documents can answer. The fourth myth whispers of conspiracy, imagining the archives as the nerve center of hidden power, where puppet masters disguised as priests pull the strings of world events, where every powerful person who ever lived left behind confessions and compromising documents that the Church preserves as ammunition, ready to deploy blackmail when necessary to maintain influence, where secret societies like the Illuminati or the Freemasons are documented in exhaustive detail, their plots and memberships recorded. And in this telling, the Vatican becomes not a spiritual institution, but a political machine of terrifying efficiency, its archives transformed into arsenals of damaging information. This myth perhaps reveals more about modern anxieties regarding power and secrecy than about the archives themselves. While diplomatic correspondence between popes and monarchs certainly touches on politically sensitive matters, while certain documents remain classified to protect privacy or diplomatic relationships, the notion of systematic use of archival materials for blackmail belongs to fiction. The Church has wielded enormous influence throughout history through moral authority, diplomatic skill, strategic alliances, control of resources, and the loyalty of millions of faithful, not through a vast blackmail operation enabled by compromising documents. And most of what the archives contain, when we examine them honestly, is simply the bureaucratic record of a large institution, fascinating to historians, but hardly the stuff of conspiracy. Thrillers. These myths endure because they satisfy something in us. this hunger for hidden knowledge, this conviction that somewhere there must exist answers to our questions, explanations for our confusions, and who can blame those who believe for the way archives themselves seem designed to inspire wonder. 85 kilometers of shelving, some counts say, though measurements vary depending on how one calculates, stretching through rooms and corridors and buildings. 12 centuries of accumulated paper and parchment, access granted only to qualified researchers who present credentials and demonstrate scholarly purpose. And even then, each visitor sees only the tiniest fraction, the documents they specifically request, while the vast majority rests unseen. And in this restriction, however necessary for preservation, we find fuel for imagination. For what is hidden, we assume, must be hidden for a reason. But now we set aside the myths gently, with respect for the human need that birthed them, and we turn to something stranger and deeper than any fiction, the actual history of these archives and the institution that created them. And we begin not in recent centuries, but at the very beginning, in the catacombs of early Christianity, when to proclaim faith in Christ meant to risk death under Roman law. In those underground chambers carved from soft tufa stone beneath the Roman countryside, where the faithful gathered to worship and to bury their dead, the first Christians kept records. Simple things, mostly, lists of martyrs whose names must not be forgotten, copies of letters from apostles read aloud in secret meetings, accounts of miracles witnessed, genealogies establishing apostolic succession. And these documents were precious, beyond measure, passed hand to hand, hidden when necessary, copied when originals grew too fragile, the beginning of what would become a great river of documentation. The catacombs still exist. You can visit them, walk through passages where ancient Christians once gathered, see the frescoes painted on chamber walls, Christ as Good Shepherd, fish and anchor symbols, Greek letters Alpha and Omega. And you can imagine, if you try, those early believers in flickering lamplight, one of them reading from a carefully copied text while others listened, committing words to memory against the day when the documents might be seized and destroyed. When Constantine embraced Christianity in the 4th century, when persecution ended and the church emerged from hiding into imperial favor, everything changed. Churches could be built of stone, open to daylight. Bishops could be appointed openly to govern growing congregations. Councils could be called to debate theology and practice. And all of this generated documents, decisions that needed recording, letters exchanged across the Christian world, legal instruments establishing rights and properties, the beginning of ecclesiastical bureaucracy. The papal court, centered in Rome, where Peter had been martyred, became an administrative center, and with administration came the need for archives, though nothing yet like the organized institution we know today, more a collection of chests and cabinets where important documents were stored, moved when circumstances required, sometimes lost to fire or flood or the chaos of invasion. The fall of Rome in 476, the beginning of that period once called the Dark Ages, though modern historians rightly complicate that darkness, these were difficult centuries for preservation. Libraries burned, manuscripts disappeared, knowledge painstakingly accumulated over generations vanished in moments of violence or neglect. But the church survived, and with it, some portion of classical learning, preserved in monastery scriptoriums where monks devoted their lives to copying texts, both sacred and secular, their fingers cramped from gripping the pen, their eyes strained. From reading by candlelight, the scratch of quill on parchment, a steady rhythm through the centuries. And in this way, Virgil and Ovid survived, Cicero and Seneca, copied by Christian monks who saw no contradiction between their faith and the wisdom of pagan antiquity, and these copies eventually found their way into the broader collection of papal documents, mingling with letters from missionaries in distant lands, records of church councils, theological treatises, the accumulated written heritage of Western Christianity. The medieval papacy, growing in power and ambition, required ever more sophisticated administration. Popes mediated between kingdoms, excommunicated emperors, called crusades, granted dispensations, heard appeals, collected taxes, appointed clergy across Europe, and every action generated paperwork. On the 27th of November in the year 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at Clermont in France and preached a sermon that would echo through centuries, calling on Christian warriors to march to Jerusalem and liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control. And thus began the Crusades, those bloody campaigns that would dominate European politics and imagination for 200 years. And in the archives, we find documents related to these crusades, bulls authorizing them, letters organizing them, accounts from those who participated, the paper trail of holy war. Among these documents rests a papal bull from 1198, issued by Pope Innocent III, effectively launching the Fourth Crusade, that tragic expedition that set out to liberate Jerusalem, but ended instead with the sack of Constantinople, Christian warriors destroying a Christian city in one of history's great betrayals, and the Pope's initial authorization sits in the archives alongside his later condemnation of the Crusades' outcome, calling it an example of affliction and the works of hell. And these documents together tell a story of intentions gone awry, of plans that spiraled beyond control, of the gap between what we hope for and what we achieve. The archives contain a document of particular fascination to those interested in the Crusades and medieval military orders, a parchment 60 meters long when unrolled, comprising the minutes of the trials of the Knights Templar, that order of warrior monks who had fought in the Holy Land and accumulated enormous wealth and power, until King Philip IV of France, desperate for money and envious of their resources, accused them of heresy, devil worship, obscene rituals, and other crimes, real or invented, and Pope Clement V, under intense pressure from the French crown, authorized investigations and trials that lasted years, during which knights were tortured until they confessed to whatever their interrogators wished to hear. And the order was ultimately dissolved in 1312, its members scattered, its wealth seized, its reputation destroyed. For centuries, historians knew of these trials only from secondary sources and fragments. But in 2007, the Vatican made public this lengthy document that had rested in the archives for 700 years. And what it revealed surprised scholars, for it showed that Pope Clement V had initially intended to pardon the Knights Templar, recognizing that confessions obtained through torture were unreliable. But he was coerced into condemning them by political pressure he could not resist. And this document reminds us that even popes, supposedly wielding divine authority, operated within political constraints, subject to pressures from secular rulers who commanded armies and controlled territories. And sometimes moral clarity had to yield to political necessity, however tragic the result. The 14th century brought crisis to the papacy itself, a division so profound that Catholic Christendom split into competing factions, each claiming legitimacy, each declaring the others invalid. Beginning in 1378 and lasting until 1417, a period known as the Western Schism, there were at times 3 different men claiming to be the legitimate pope, one in Rome, one in Avignon in southern France, one in Pisa, each issuing bulls and appointing cardinals, each insisting he alone possessed valid authority, and Catholic Christians across Europe had to choose whom to follow, with kingdoms and regions divided in their loyalties. And the archives preserved documents from this chaotic period, letters and bulls from competing claimants, records of the councils that eventually resolved the schism by deposing all claimants and electing a new pope acceptable to all parties, though not before decades of confusion and division that weakened Church's authority and moral standing. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued a papal bull that would have terrible consequences, authorizing and indeed commanding the hunting down of witches, declaring witchcraft a real and dangerous heresy that must be exterminated. And this document, preserved in the archives, helped unleash centuries of persecution. Tens of thousands of people, mostly women, accused of impossible crimes, tortured into false confessions, executed by burning or hanging, and modern readers examining this bull in the archives must confront the reality that the Church, which often acted as a force for education and charity, was also capable of sanctioning cruelty based on superstition, that institutions claiming divine guidance can still make catastrophic moral errors, that documents sealed with holy authority can authorize evil. The early 16th century brought the Protestant Reformation, that great rupture that split Western Christianity permanently. On the 3rd of January, 1521, Pope Leo VI issued a papal bull titled Decet Romanum Pontificem, formally excommunicating Martin Luther, that German monk whose 95 theses had sparked a firestorm of controversy. And this document sits in the archives, the formal instrument of division, the moment when reconciliation became impossible and schism inevitable. And Luther, upon hearing of his excommunication, reportedly said, "I am now free," and indeed he was, free to build a new form of Christianity outside papal authority, and within decades, millions of European Christians would follow him into Protestantism. And the religious unity of Western Europe, already strained, would shatter completely. Among the most poignant documents in the archives is a massive petition, 3 feet wide when spread open, covered in signatures and seals. 81 signatures in all, including members of Parliament, clergy, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Himself addressed to Pope Clement VII in 1530, requesting that His Holiness grant an annulment to King Henry VIII of England, declaring his marriage to Catherine of Aragon invalid, so that he might marry Anne Boleyn and produce a male heir. And the language of the petition is threatening, warning that refusal would require England to take extreme measures for the good of the kingdom, measures they would not hesitate to employ. And Pope Clement, caught between English threats and Spanish pressure, for Catherine was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, who commanded vast armies, ultimately refused the annulment, and Henry responded by breaking with Rome entirely, establishing the Church of England with himself as its head, seizing monastery lands, executing those who opposed him, transforming English religion and politics forever. And this document, this petition, with its dozens of signatures and seals, marks the moment before the break, when perhaps reconciliation was still possible, though in retrospect it seems inevitable. In 1550, Michelangelo Buonarroti, that supreme genius of the Renaissance, already elderly but still working on St. Peter's Basilica, sat down to write a letter to papal administrators, and his words, preserved in his own handwriting in the archives, are not lofty discussions of art and beauty, but practical complaints about money. He had not been paid for 3 months. His workers demanded wages he could not provide. A papal conclave had interrupted his work on the Great Dome, and he wrote with frustration, bordering on anger, demanding what was owed to him. And when you see this letter, if you are fortunate enough to view the original, you are struck by its humanity. For here is Michelangelo not as the sublime artist of legend, but as a working man chasing payment from a bureaucratic institution. And somehow, this makes his achievement more rather than less remarkable. For the Sistine Chapel's ceiling and St. Peter's dome were created not in some realm of pure artistic inspiration, but in the messy reality of late payments and administrative complications, beauty born from struggle. The year 1586 brought another letter to the archives, this one written on February 8th by Mary Queen of Scots, imprisoned in Fotheringay Castle in England, knowing her execution was imminent, writing to Pope Sixtus V to pledge her eternal allegiance to Rome and to commend her soul to God, and the letter, written in elegant French, carries the weight of impending death. A queen facing the block for plotting against her cousin Elizabeth, maintaining her Catholic faith to the end. And when you read her words, even in translation, you feel the presence of a human being in extremity, facing mortality with courage and faith. And within months of writing this letter, she would be beheaded, and the letter itself would make its way to Rome, preserved in the archives as testimony to her final loyalty. The 17th century saw the scientific revolution challenge traditional understandings of the cosmos, and nowhere was this conflict more dramatically embodied than in the trial of Galileo Galilei. In 1633, Galileo, already elderly and in poor health, was brought before the Inquisition to answer charges of heresy for teaching that the earth orbits the sun, contradicting the apparent testimony of Scripture and the traditional Ptolemaic model that placed Earth at the center of creation. And the trial records, preserved in the archives, allow us to follow the proceedings day by day, the questions asked, the answers given, the theological arguments deployed, the astronomical evidence presented and dismissed, and finally the sentence, Galileo forced to recant his beliefs, condemned to house arrest for the remainder of his life, his books banned, and though legend says he muttered, "And yet it moves," after recanting, speaking of the Earth's motion, this probably never happened. But the sentiment captures the conflict between observed truth and doctrinal authority, and modern readers studying these documents must grapple with the Church's error, its choice to defend a cosmological model not because of evidence but because of tradition and interpretation of Scripture. And while some apologists argue the Church's position was more complex than simple anti-scientific obscurantism, and indeed some Vatican officials supported Galileo, the basic fact remains that he was condemned for being right, and the trial stands as warning about the dangers of allowing authority to trump evidence. In 1863, in the midst of the American Civil War, 2 letters arrived at the Vatican addressed to Pope Pius IX, one from Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, the other from Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America, both seeking recognition and support, though approaching the Pope very differently. Lincoln's letter, brief and formal, requested that the Pope accept Union Brigadier General Rufus King as the United States representative to the Papal States, making no mention of the war tearing his country apart, maintaining diplomatic courtesy and restraint. Davis's letter, by contrast, detailed the horrors of the conflict, describing the war waged by the United States government against the states and people over which he presided, appealing for papal sympathy and perhaps implicit recognition of Confederate legitimacy, and these letters, preserved in the archives, capture a moment when both sides of America's bloodiest conflict sought to claim moral authority through papal acknowledgement, though the Pope, wisely or simply cautiously, maintained neutrality and avoided formally recognizing the Confederacy. In 1887, an extraordinary letter arrived at the Vatican, written not on paper but on birch bark, sent by the Ojibwe Indians of Ontario, Canada, to Pope Leo III, and this letter, carefully preserved despite its unusual material, addresses the Pope as the Great Master of Prayer, and is date-lined not with the month of May, but where there is much grass in the month of the flowers, and it thanks the Vatican for sending a custodian of prayer, a bishop who had come to preach among them, and the letter is both touching and troubling, for it speaks to the spread of Christianity among indigenous peoples, a process that sometimes occurred through genuine spiritual seeking, but often accompanied cultural destruction and colonial oppression. And this birch bark letter, so carefully crafted, so respectful in its tone, sits in the archives as a reminder of the global reach of the Church and the complex legacy of its missionary efforts. The 20th century brought new challenges, none more terrible than the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe. In 1934, Pope Pius V wrote a strongly worded letter to Adolf Hitler, expressing grave concerns about the Nazi regime's treatment of Catholics in Germany, violations of the Concordat between the Vatican and Germany, restrictions on religious freedom. And while the letter was diplomatic in its language, it was clear in its criticism, and this draft, preserved in the archives alongside other correspondence with Nazi officials, shows the Church attempting to navigate an impossible situation, trying to protect Catholics under Nazi rule while avoiding actions that might provoke worse persecution. And historians debate endlessly whether the Church did enough, whether stronger public condemnation might have saved lives or simply provoked retaliation, whether the diplomatic approach represented moral compromise or tragic necessity, and the documents in the archives provide evidence but not easy answers. The archives also contain a letter from Emperor Hirohito of Japan, received by Pope Pius XV during World War II, an extraordinary communication between the leader of an empire at war and the head of the Catholic Church, discussing matters of faith and politics in the midst of global conflict. And while the full contents remain matter for scholarly interpretation, the very existence of such correspondence reminds us that even in the darkest hours, diplomatic channels remained open. Lines of communication persisted across battle lines. The Second Vatican Council, that great gathering of bishops from 1962 to 1965 that transformed Catholic practice and theology, generated mountains of documents, all of which now rest in the archives, the preparatory materials and draft documents, the debates and amendments, the final approved texts, and the dissenting opinions. And these materials allow historians to reconstruct how the Council developed, whose ideas prevailed and whose were sidelined, how the Church attempted to adapt to modernity while maintaining continuity with tradition. And this documentation will occupy scholars for generations, revealing the complex process by which institutions change, the tension between innovation and preservation, the personalities and politics behind decisions that seem inevitable in retrospect but were fiercely contested at the time. But let us step back from specific documents, remarkable as they are, and consider the archives themselves as institution and space. Imagine entering through the guarded entrance, presenting credentials, explaining research, receiving a numbered badge. The rooms beyond are not designed to impress like the Sistine Chapel or St. Peter's, but they possess their own austere beauty. Arched ceilings, stone floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, tall wooden shelving reaching toward shadows above, and everywhere the presence of documents, bound volumes and loose folios, boxes and bundles tied with ribbon, each one a voice from the past. The reading room where researchers work is profoundly quiet, silence broken only by whisper of turning pages and scratch of pencils on note paper. No pens allowed, nothing that might damage precious documents, certainly no food or drink, and scholars sit at wooden tables under reading lamps, manuscripts spread before them. On their faces we see concentration, sometimes excitement, occasionally frustration, when handwriting proves indecipherable or Latin syntax particularly convoluted, but always a kind of reverence, awareness that they touch history, that the parchment beneath their fingers was once held by popes and cardinals, by kings and emperors, by ordinary people whose lives have ended, but whose words remain. The smell of the archives is distinctive. Dust and old paper and leather, that particular scent that develops in rooms where documents have rested undisturbed for decades or centuries. And there is something about this smell that speaks to time itself, to the patient accumulation of years, to the slow process by which present becomes past, and past becomes history. And those who work regularly in the archives become familiar with this scent, find it comforting even, for it signals a place where time moves differently, where the urgent crises of today matter less than the long accumulation of human experience. The archivists who work here, who spend careers among these documents, develop an intimacy with the collection that outsiders can never quite achieve. They know where things are, not just through catalogs, but through memory and instinct. They recognize handwriting styles and can date documents by subtle clues of paper and ink. They understand contexts and connections that transform isolated documents into evidence of larger patterns, and they serve as guides for visiting researchers, helping navigate the vastness, suggesting sources that might prove useful, warning away from paths that will prove fruitless, though always leaving actual research and interpretation to the scholars themselves. Preservation work is ongoing, constant battle against time and entropy. Paper acidifies, ink fades, parchment becomes brittle, bindings fail, and specialists work to repair and stabilize using techniques ranging from traditional bookbinding methods passed down through generations to cutting-edge technologies developed. Recently, every document that survives another century is a small victory, a voice preserved against the silence that eventually claims all things. Digitization has become increasingly important in recent decades, photographing and scanning documents to create digital copies accessible without handling originals, reducing wear while expanding access. Scholars can now request digital copies rather than traveling to Rome. And while this lacks the immediacy of working with originals, it democratizes access in ways that would have seemed impossible just a generation ago. Yet something remains irreplaceable about working with physical documents, feeling the texture of 500-year-old paper, seeing where ink has bled or water has stained, noticing marginal notes added by later readers, the physical object carrying information no photograph can fully capture, and many researchers still make the pilgrimage to Rome, still sit in that quiet reading room, still experience the particular thrill of holding history in their hands. The archives continue to grow even now. The current pontificate generates documents just as all previous ones have, correspondence and meeting records and administrative files, eventually to be filed away, cataloged, preserved, held for decades before being opened to research, and they, too, will become part of the historical record, primary sources for future scholars studying our time as we study centuries past. What picture of the Church emerges from these documents when studied carefully? A complex picture, certainly, an institution shaped by its times even as it tried to shape those times, torn between spiritual ideals and political necessities, sometimes rising to great moral heights, and sometimes falling into complicity with injustice, always convinced of its essential rightness, yet constantly adapting to circumstances, filled with individuals who were saints and scoundrels, and mostly something in between, people trying to do what they thought right in situations where the right path was not always clear. The archives show us the Church as human institution, not human in sense of being merely human, stripped of divine purpose, but human in acknowledging that whatever transcendent mission the Church claims, it has always been carried out by flesh and blood people, people with prejudices and blind spots, with ambitions and fears, with varying degrees of wisdom and courage and compassion, and the documents preserve their choices, their debates, their certainties, and their doubts, allowing us to understand not just what happened, but how and why. For historians, the Vatican archives are an incomparable resource, touching on nearly every aspect of European and global history for more than a millennium. The Church's reach extended everywhere. Its interests encompassed everything from high theology to mundane economics. Its correspondence network linked remote monasteries to royal courts to missionary outposts on distant continents, and all of this generated documents enough survived to provide evidence illuminating topics far beyond Church history, narrowly defined. As evening falls over Rome, as shadows lengthen across the piazza of St. Peter, as the last tourists take their photographs and first stars appear above the dome that Michelangelo designed, somewhere in the depths of the Vatican complex, the archives rest in their climate-controlled darkness, 85 kilometers of shelving holding 12 centuries of documents, millions upon millions of pages, waiting patiently for tomorrow's researchers, for the next question, for the ongoing conversation between past and present that gives both meaning. And in that waiting, there is something eternal, something that transcends individual lives and pontificates, something that connects us all across the centuries, the simple fact that we were here, that we lived and hoped and struggled and loved, that we tried to make sense of our world and leave something behind, and that effort, however imperfect, however flawed, however mixed in its results, is preserved here in paper and ink, in darkness and dust, in the secret archives of the Vatican, where memory waits, patient as stone, deep as time itself. Beyond the documents of grand historical moment, beyond the letters from queens facing execution, and the bulls that launched crusades, the archives contain something equally precious, the ordinary records of ordinary lives, and these too deserve our attention, our patient examination, for they tell us how people actually lived, what they believed, what they feared, what they hoped for, in an age so different from our own, yet populated by humans fundamentally like us. Consider the marriage records, thousands upon thousands of them, stretching back through centuries, documenting unions blessed by the Church. And within these routine administrative documents, we find stories. A marriage between a merchant's daughter and a nobleman's younger son, the families negotiating terms, the Church granting dispensation for some impediment to the union, Perhaps they were distant cousins, and canon law required papal permission for such marriages, and the document records all of this, the names and dates and circumstances, and we can imagine, if we try, the young couple standing before a priest, speaking vows that would bind them for life, and whether they loved each other or barely knew each other, whether the marriage was arranged for property and alliance or grew from genuine affection. The document cannot tell us, but it preserves their names, ensures they are not entirely forgotten. The baptismal records are similarly numerous, marking the entry of new Christians into the faith, infant after infant across the centuries, sometimes royalty, more often ordinary people. And these records served practical purposes, establishing identity and legitimacy, proving citizenship and inheritance rights. But they also served spiritual ones, marking a soul's entry into the community of believers. And the formulaic language of these documents, repeated thousands of times with only names and dates changing, creates a kind of poetry through repetition, a rhythm that speaks to the endless renewal of human life, generation after generation, each child baptized in hope, carried to the font by parents who wished for them health and happiness and salvation. Death records complete the cycle, noting the passing of popes and cardinals, certainly, but also of ordinary clergy and lay people whose deaths brought them into contact with church bureaucracy, perhaps someone who left property to the church, or whose will needed ecclesiastical approval, or who died in pilgrimage to Rome and required documentation for relatives back home. And these records of death, like the records of birth and marriage, remind us that the Church was intimately involved in the life cycle of medieval and early modern Europeans, present at every significant transition, recording and sanctifying, and making official what might otherwise have been merely personal and private. The financial records, often overlooked by researchers seeking more dramatic materials, repay careful study, for they reveal the economic foundations of church operations. Accounts of money received and spent, showing us how wealth flowed from all over Christian Europe to Rome, how it was allocated to various purposes, the costs of maintaining churches and paying clergy, funding charitable works, and supporting artistic patronage, the mundane economic reality underlying spiritual mission. These ledgers, carefully maintained by papal accountants across centuries, use abbreviations and notations that require expertise to decipher, but once decoded, they tell us what things cost, how money moved, what the church valued enough to spend, resources on, and sometimes we find surprises, expenditures that seem odd or revealing, payments for things we might not have expected, evidence of priorities that complicate our understanding of church history. There are records of indulgences, those controversial instruments by which the church offered remission of temporal punishment for sins in exchange for various acts, including monetary donations. And these documents became flashpoints for reform. Luther's 95 Theses were posted in direct response to the selling of indulgences to finance the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, and the records in the archives document this practice in exhaustive detail: how much money was raised, how it was used, the theological justifications offered, the criticisms leveled even from within the Church, and modern researchers examining these materials must grapple with the reality that an institution claiming divine authority nevertheless engaged in practices that seem to many modern readers corrupt, or at least deeply problematic, though we must also recognize that medieval Christians understood indulgences differently than we do, within a framework of penance and purgatory that made sense to them, even if it strikes us as strange. The archives contain extensive materials related to religious orders, the Franciscans and Dominicans, the Jesuits and Benedictines, the countless communities of monks and nuns who devoted their lives to prayer and service, and these documents chronicle the founding of orders, the approval of their rules, disputes over interpretation of those rules, visitations to assess whether communities were living according to their vows, reforms initiated when communities had strayed from their original purposes, and through these records we can trace the evolution of religious life over centuries, how different orders responded to different needs and different historical moments, how charismatic founders attracted followers and established institutions that outlasted them by centuries, how communities struggled with the tension between spiritual ideals and human weakness. Among the most fascinating materials in this category are the records related to mystics and visionaries, individuals who claimed direct experience of the divine, visions of Christ or Mary or angels, revelations of theological truths or future events, and the Church approached such claims with careful skepticism, investigating to determine whether the visions were genuine divine communications or products of delusion or deception. And the investigation records preserved testimony from the visionaries themselves, describing their experiences in vivid detail, the sights and sounds and sensations of mystical encounter, and whether we believe these accounts describe real supernatural experiences or psychological phenomena. They give us access to extraordinary states of consciousness, to experiences of transcendence and meaning that were central to many medieval and early modern lives. Saint Catherine of Siena, that remarkable woman who lived in the 14th century, experienced visions from childhood, ecstatic encounters with Christ that she described in letters and that witnesses corroborated, and she used the authority these visions gave her to involve herself in politics at the highest level, corresponding with popes and kings, urging the return of the papacy from Avignon to Rome, ministering to the sick and poor, while also advising the powerful. And the archives contain letters from her, written in her own hand or dictated to scribes, letters of remarkable passion and eloquence, addressing popes with a familiarity that would have been shocking from anyone else, calling them to live up to their responsibilities, rebuking them when she felt they failed. And these letters, preserved in the archives, show us a woman claiming spiritual authority in an age when women were generally excluded from such roles, using her visions as credential and her intelligence and force of personality as tools. And whether her visions were divine communications or products of her own devout imagination, they enabled her to speak and act with extraordinary freedom, and the Church eventually recognized her sanctity, canonizing her, and even naming her a Doctor of the Church, one of only 4 women to receive that honor. Let us turn now to the physical processes by which the archives are maintained, for this too is part of their story. The patient work required to preserve memory against time's corrosive action. In conservation laboratories within the Vatican complex, specialists work on documents that have suffered damage from age or misuse, water or fire, insects or simple handling, and their work requires both scientific knowledge and artistic skill, understanding the chemistry of paper and ink, the structure of bindings, the techniques of medieval scribes, and using this knowledge to stabilize and restore, always with the principle of minimal intervention, doing only what is necessary to preserve the document, never attempting to make it look new or hide the evidence of its age. A conservator might spend weeks on a single document, carefully cleaning dirt and grime that have accumulated over centuries, using soft brushes and specialized solutions, working under magnification to see individual fibers of paper, and the work requires patience and steady hands, the ability to concentrate for hours on minute details, and there is satisfaction in this work, revealing text that has been obscured, stabilizing paper so it can survive another century, repairing damage so future researchers can access the information the document contains. Some documents arrive at conservation in terrible condition, having survived fire or flood, the paper charred and brittle or waterlogged and moldy, the ink faded to near invisibility, and in these cases the conservators must make difficult decisions about whether restoration is even possible, whether attempting to handle the document might cause it to disintegrate completely, and sometimes the answer is that nothing can be done, that the document is too fragile to save, and these are sad moments acknowledging that despite all expertise and effort, some voices from the past will be lost. Some stories will remain untold. But technology offers new possibilities for recovering information from damaged documents. Multispectral imaging can reveal text that is invisible to the naked eye, ink that has faded or been scraped away, by photographing the document under different wavelengths of light, and then processing the images to enhance contrast. And this technology has allowed researchers to read palimpsests, those parchments where an earlier text was scraped off and the parchment reused for a new text, recovering works thought lost for centuries. Mathematical treatises by Archimedes, plays by ancient dramatists, gospels rejected as apocryphal but preserving alternative traditions about Jesus and the apostles. The cataloging work proceeds alongside conservation, the patient process of describing documents so that future researchers can find them. And this work too requires specialized knowledge, the ability to read various scripts and languages, to recognize different types of documents and understand their contexts, to extract the essential information and record it in standardized formats that allow for searching and retrieval. And a cataloger might spend an entire day on a single box of documents, examining each one, determining its date and authorship and subject, writing descriptions that will guide researchers who might consult the catalog decades hence. The digitization program has accelerated in recent years, recognizing that digital copies can expand access while protecting originals, and teams of photographers work their way through the collection, setting up documents on specialized stands, photographing them under carefully controlled lighting, creating high-resolution images that capture every detail, and these images are then processed and stored, backed up in multiple locations to ensure they survive any disaster, and made available through databases that researchers can access from anywhere in the world. And while this democratizes access in wonderful ways, it also raises questions about what it means to study history, whether examining a digital image provides the same information as handling an original document. And most researchers would say that while digital access is valuable, irreplaceable even, there remains something important about physical contact with historical materials, a directness and immediacy that cannot be fully replicated through screens. The archives continue to receive new materials, for the papal bureaucracy generates documents just as it always has, correspondence and reports and meeting minutes and administrative files, all the paper trail of a global institution, and these modern materials are processed according to established protocols, cataloged and stored, restricted for decades to protect privacy and diplomatic sensitivities, but eventually to be open to researchers who will study our time as we study centuries past, and this reminds us that we too are creating history, that our actions and decisions will be examined by future generations who will judge us by standards we cannot anticipate, just as we judge past generations by standards they might not have recognized. The reading room, where researchers work with the documents, operates according to strict rules designed to protect the materials while allowing access. No pens, only pencils, so that no permanent mark can accidentally be made on a document. No food or drink, no bags larger than necessary. Everything that enters the reading room is inspected to ensure it poses no threat to the documents. Researchers must wash their hands before handling materials, and gloves are sometimes required for particularly fragile items, though for many documents, bare, clean hands are actually preferable, providing better tactile sensitivity and reducing the risk of dropping or tearing. The atmosphere in the reading room is one of focused quiet. Scholars bend over their work, occasionally rising to consult reference books or to request another document from the archive staff, who retrieve materials from the storage areas and deliver them to researchers, and then return them when the researcher has finished, checking them back into their designated locations, maintaining the order that allows hundreds of thousands of documents to be tracked and retrieved. And this constant movement of materials from storage to reading room and back again is itself a kind of choreography, requiring coordination and care, ensuring that documents are never misplaced, that the integrity of the collection is maintained. Some researchers work alone, pursuing individual projects, but others come in teams, especially when working through large collections of correspondence or administrative records, dividing the labor, sharing discoveries, building collaborative understanding of complex historical episodes. And the reading room becomes a space of scholarly community where researchers from different countries and institutions share a common purpose: the recovery and interpretation of historical evidence, and conversations occur in whispered tones during breaks. Researchers comparing notes, offering suggestions, building the networks of mutual support that sustain academic work. The archivists themselves, those who work permanently with the collection, develop relationships with regular visitors, researchers who return year after year to continue long-term projects. And these relationships, built on shared respect for our materials and mutual interest in historical questions, can last decades. The archivists watching researchers progress from graduate students writing dissertations to established scholars producing major works, and there is satisfaction in this, knowing that they have facilitated important scholarship, that their work preserving and organizing the archives has enabled discoveries and insights that enrich human knowledge. And sometimes, rarely but memorably, there are moments of genuine discovery when a researcher finds something no modern scholar has seen before, a document misfiled centuries ago and now recovered, or a marginal note that changes understanding of a text's authorship or date, or a connection between apparently unrelated materials that reveals a pattern no one had noticed. And these discoveries, even small ones, create excitement that ripples through the scholarly community. Articles and books that revise historical understanding, and the archives fulfill their highest purpose, serving not as monument to the past, but as resource for present understanding. Yet we must acknowledge that the archives, comprehensive as they are, contain silences and absences. The Church's bureaucracy recorded what it considered important, which means that certain voices are preserved in abundance while others are nearly absent. We have extensive records of papal correspondence with kings and emperors, but very little from ordinary lay people. We have theological treatises written by educated clergy, but almost nothing recording the beliefs of illiterate peasants who formed the majority of medieval Christians. We have accounts of church councils and doctrinal disputes, but less about daily religious practice, how ordinary people actually experience their faith in their homes and villages. Women's voices are particularly scarce, for in a male-dominated institution, women rarely occupied positions that generated preserved documentation, and when they do appear in the records, it is often mediated through male scribes and investigators. Filtered through assumptions and prejudices, we must work to recognize and account for. And feminist historians have developed sophisticated methods for reading between the lines of these documents, finding evidence of women's agency and experience, even in sources that were not intended to preserve them, but the work is difficult, like trying to see through fog, and much remains irretrievable, lost not through accidental destruction, but through systematic exclusion, the historical record shaped by who held power to create and preserve documentation. Similarly, the perspectives of non-Christians, of Jews and Muslims, and pagans and heretics, are preserved primarily through the lens of Christian authorities who considered them threats or objects of conversion. And we must read these accounts critically, aware that they tell us as much about Christian prejudices as about the actual beliefs and practices of those they describe. And this is a general problem with historical sources, that they are created by those with power and literacy. Representing their perspectives and interests and recovering the voices of the marginalized and excluded requires creative reading against the grain of documents, finding unintended evidence, recognizing silences as significant. The archives, then, are not a complete record of the past. They are the record that the Church created and preserved, which is valuable and important, but also partial and biased. And responsible historical scholarship must acknowledge these limitations while working with what survives, and sometimes what survives is sufficient to reconstruct events and experiences with reasonable confidence, while other times we must admit that we simply do not know, that the evidence does not exist or has not survived, and there is honesty in acknowledging the limits of our knowledge, refusing to speculate beyond what evidence supports. As we move toward the conclusion of our meditation, our slow walk through these corridors of memory, let us reflect on what the archives represent, not just historically, but philosophically. What they tell us about the human relationship with time and memory and meaning. We are mortal creatures, our lives brief against the span of centuries, yet we have this extraordinary capacity to preserve experience in symbols, to translate thought and sensation into marks on parchment that can outlast us by hundreds of years, allowing communication across time, the dead speaking to the living. And this is one of our defining characteristics as humans, this need to record and remember, to resist the forgetting that time imposes. The archives are monuments to this resistance, to the belief that the past matters, that what previous generations thought and did and said deserves preservation. That memory is valuable not just for practical reasons, though it serves those purposes too, but for its own sake, because we become more fully human when we situate ourselves in time, understanding where we came from and how we got here, seeing ourselves as part of a story that began before us and will continue after us. And this long perspective can be humbling, reminding us how small we are, but also elevating, connecting us to something larger than our individual lives. In a world increasingly oriented toward the immediate, toward the present moment, and the instant reaction, the archives offer counterweight, insisting on the value of patience and depth. the rewards of slow, careful examination, the insights that come from sustained attention to materials that do not yield their meanings quickly or easily. And there is something almost countercultural in this, the quiet scholarly work that proceeds in the reading room while outside the digital world races forward at ever-increasing speed, and both have their place, certainly. But perhaps we need the archives more than ever. Need the reminder that not everything worth knowing can be Googled, that some knowledge requires time and effort and expertise to access. The archives also remind us of the fragility of cultural memory, how much can be lost through accident or neglect or deliberate destruction, how the preservation of historical materials requires constant work and resources, institutions and expertise, maintained across generations. And in our time when digital information seems infinite and permanent, we might forget how vulnerable it actually is, how dependent on infrastructure and formats that become obsolete, how easily it can be corrupted or deleted, and the Vatican archives, with their centuries of accumulated paper and parchment, represent a more durable form of preservation, slower and more limited certainly, but proven across time in ways that digital storage has not yet been. And finally, the archives represent a kind of faith, not just religious faith, though they are the archives of a religious institution, but faith in the human project itself, the idea that our species, despite all our flaws and failures, our violence and stupidity and selfishness, nevertheless produces things worth saving, ideas worth preserving, experiences worth sharing across time, and the careful work of conservation and cataloging, the patient scholarship that recovers and interprets all of. This embodies this faith, this commitment to memory and meaning, this refusal to let the past disappear into silence. As we prepare to leave these quiet halls, as we surrender our documents to the archivists and turn our badges and step back out into the noise and movement of contemporary Rome, we carry with us something of what we have experienced here, this encounter with time made tangible in paper and ink, this awareness of the long human story of which we are part, this sense of connection to countless individuals across the centuries who also lived and hoped and struggled and left behind traces of their passage. And perhaps this awareness might change us slightly, might make us more thoughtful about our own place in time, more conscious of what we are creating and preserving for future generations, more humble before the vastness of history, and yet more determined to contribute something worthy to it. The secret archives of the Vatican, then, are secret only in their original Latin sense of private, belonging to the institution that created them, but opened gradually to those who seek knowledge, who come with proper credentials and scholarly purpose, with questions to be answered and puzzles to be solved. And what they contain is memory, vast and varied, imperfect but precious. The documentary heritage of an institution that has existed for nearly 2,000 years and has carefully preserved records of its existence. And these records tell us about far more than church history narrowly defined. They illuminate politics and art, science and philosophy, daily life and extraordinary events, the full, rich complexity of human experience over more than a millennium. And in this illumination there is value beyond scholarship, beyond the academic contributions that researchers make, value for all of us who seek to understand ourselves and our world, who recognize that the present emerges from the past and carries it forward into the future, who believe that memory matters, that history is not simply one damn thing after another, but a source of wisdom and warning, of inspiration and caution, of stories that help us make sense of our own stories. And the archives preserve these stories, guard them against time and forgetting, make them available to those who seek them. And in this work, humble and patient, continuing across generations, there is something essential, something that speaks to what is best in us, our capacity for care and preservation, our commitment to knowledge and truth, our refusal to let the voices of the past be silenced. As evening deepens over Rome, as lights come on across the city, as the great dome of St. Peter's stands silhouetted against the darkening sky, somewhere in the climate-controlled darkness of the archive storage, 85 kilometers of shelving hold 12 centuries of documents, millions of pages of text waiting patiently for tomorrow's researchers for the next question, for the ongoing conversation between past and present that gives both meaning. And in that waiting, there is something eternal, something that transcends individual lives and even civilizations. The simple fact that we were here, that we lived and thought and acted, that we tried to understand our world and ourselves and to leave something behind. And that effort, however imperfect, however flawed, however mixed in its results and consequences, is worth preserving, worth studying, worth honoring. And the secret archives of the Vatican, in their quiet, devoted service to this purpose, remind us of what we are capable of at our best, not the violence and stupidity that fill so many historical pages, but the patient care for memory, the commitment to preservation, the belief that what has been known and felt and experienced deserves to survive. And in this belief there is hope, fragile perhaps, but enduring, that we might yet learn from our past, that memory might yet guide us toward wisdom, that the long human story might yet find meanings worth all the suffering and struggle it has cost. And this hope, preserved in paper and ink, in darkness and dust, in the secret archives of the Vatican, waits for us still, patient as stone, deep as time, quiet as prayer, eternal as the questions we carry with us through the brief arc of our lives, the questions that make us human and that only memory, preserved and shared across generations, can help us answer. Thank you for spending this night with History Before Sleep Stories. May your dreams be calm, your sleep be deep, and your mind return to history whenever you wish to wander again. Good night.